The U.S. election of 2000, George W. Bush versus Al Gore. The 2000 election is seen as one of the major elections in U.S. history. There are many aspects that lead to this to being such a major election. First of all, the buildup of the years coming into the new millennium was a chaotic time. The election also was only the fourth in U.S. history where the winner of the popular vote did not coincide with the outcome of the Electoral College. On top of all this, the election did not have a definite winner until over a month later when the Supreme Court decided that no more recounts would be allowed as they violated the Equal Protections Clause. This specific election is a great example of the power in the legislative branch, separation of powers, and the significance of the Electoral College. All of these lead to one of the wildest elections to ever be performed in the US. Now let's start out by going over the State of the Union in the United States leading up to the new millennium. Under the Clinton administration, the U.S. economy had been on the rise and looked positive. Also under this administration, the United States had seen its first surplus in years. Therefore, these two aspects were seen as a stance that either Bush or Gore had to follow. Another major wave of technology and science began evolving in these years. These include the growth of the information age and scientific following of global warming. The internet had now become a tool everyone could use, making this era an era of overwhelming fast access to knowledge. However, people feared that a bug would destroy the internet as they knew it at the start of the new millennium. This idea, called Y2K, proposed that with the changing in the new millennium, on every computer, disaster would occur, such as planes falling out of the sky and missiles would fire accidentally. Of course, none of this ever happened. But the idea of the power of the internet was a frontrunner to shape the ideas of the two candidates. Overall, this new era was defined by new scientific discoveries such as renewable energy and the growth of the modern internet. Next, we will go over the stances of each candidate to give a background. Starting out with Governor George W. Bush. George Bush, being a candidate of the Republican Party, kept with the very traditional conservative viewpoint approach in his stances. George Bush was against abortion, promised to increase spending to the military, planned to cut taxes by a whopping $483 billion, and keep the policies of the ability to bear arms the same. Scientists and more liberal government employees disliked most of George Bush's stances on the environment. As the time changed, the ideas to preserve and protect our Earth became more prominent. Individuals believed Bush's plans, such as giving tax breaks for ethanol use, were a slap to the face to the people who wanted to care for the environment. However, President Bush also declared some more liberal approaches to areas for reform. Bush planned to increase spending in education and increase the number of individuals that received health care, trying to make it more nationwide. Many individuals called these ideas of Bush reckless and could potentially harm the country in the long run. Now on to former Vice President Al Gore. As a member and candidate of the Democratic Party, Al Gore's views were shifted in a more environmentally friendly approach in the new millennium. Al Gore stood strong with his stances to cut carbon emissions to prevent global warming, balance the federal budget, prevent discrimination of same-sex couples, and promise for restructure of education. These stances set him apart as more of a green activist to individuals. Some believed his stances on the environment prevented corruption and could hurt the economy, but Gore had a strong backing and stance to keep these ideas of renewable energy going. As one could see, these two candidates fit the bill, following the Republican having more conservative stances and the Democrat having more liberal stances. The difference, however, in this election is how much more emphasis was put on the idea of preventing the new mainstream of global warming. This worried a lot of citizens in the US and very much affected the two stances the candidates had on the environment. Another difference in these candidates' stances from any previous election is how they had to focus on technology. Technology and the internet were now available on everyday person, so this created viewpoints for each candidate towards these new issues. Now on to the controversial aspect that shaped this whole election. The election took place on November 7th in the year 2000, but the actual deciding factor was not put through until December 12th of that same year. This happened due to how close the actual election was. As mentioned before, this was one of the few elections where the candidate who won the popular vote did not win the presidency. Ultimately, this win of presidency came down to the state of Florida, whose votes were so close that a state law came into effect as the margins of difference in votes was less than 0.5%. The difficult part of recounting these votes were the discrepancies in the ballots. These discrepancies were known as hanging chad, swinging chad, tri-chad, and a pregnant chad. These have to do with how the hole punched through the ballot left the paper dangling or just a dimple in the paper rather than a full pressed hole through the ballot. Eventually, the decision was that hanging chads, swinging chads, and tri-chads would count as a vote for the candidate, while a pregnant chad would not count as a vote. In the next 3 days after the election, the first recount was finished with giving Bush the win in Florida by a tiny margin of 327 votes. Many became suspicious, however, as Bush's brother Jeb Bush was the sitting governor of Florida at the time. On the other hand, the state's Attorney General Bob Butterworth was openly supporting candidate Gore. These opposing viewpoints on the recount led to many inside arguments with the government in Florida on whether the recount should continue. However, the recounts continued in the state of Florida and other states where margins of victory were slim. Now, as the recounts continued, they showed that Bush may not have gotten a victory as they had hoped, as the votes were so close, now down to 0.1% victory margin, that they could not thoroughly decide a victor. After this news had surfaced, Bush's team filed suit against the Florida Supreme Court to cease these recounts. This case eventually made its way up to the United States Supreme Court. On December 9th, in a 5-4 decision, the court decided that the recount must cease as it had violated the Equal Protections Clause. The Equal Protections Clause is a constitutional right that no person or group of people will ever be denied protection under the law that similar persons or group of people receive. In other words, this law states that every person gets equal protections under federal law. The way the Florida Supreme Court's decision for recounts violated this was the fact that the court had now created a new election law which was reserved only for the state legislature. The United States Supreme Court also ruled that there could be no recount held in time to satisfy the federal deadline for electors. Now with the recount ceased, George W. Bush was granted the electoral votes from Florida, thus giving him the win to run for presidency. Gore conceded from fighting against this decision on December 13th, which guaranteed the 43rd selection of the President of the United States would be George W. Bush. Overall, the 2000 election is seen as one of the more exciting elections to happen in United States history. This election was one of the first to involve new ideas of those campaigning regarding global warming and new widespread technologies such as the internet. This election also is one of the few where the candidate with the popular vote did not win the election due to the process of the Electoral College. The 2000 election is a great lesson to show how the government's separation of powers works in the process of the Equal Protections Clause coming to play. This election will be remembered forever in United States history as an election that showed the great process this country goes through to maintain a place where freedom comes first to everyone.